Ladies and gentlemen, it is so wonderful to finally be back with you on this channel, doing what I normally do, giving all of you guys political commentary. Thank you so much for sticking around. My name is Christian Watson, and today we're going to be discussing what has been going on in Canada over the past month or so. Particularly, we're going to be discussing the quote-unquote media's coverage of what's been going on in Canada and how it reflects something much deeper than mere bias or a mere attempt to be smear merchants. It actually underlies a philosophical problem that is quite endemic of the way we communicate information. And hopefully, through this video, I can give you the tools to fight back against that problem in a substantial way that'll impact your life. But before we get started, my friends, as I always ask people to do before I get on, I'll get on to my message rather, I would ask you guys to subscribe, like, share, comment on this video so I can get this message out here to as many people as possible. I had not been doing this for about 4 months now for various reasons, and this is not a video talking about my life or anything, but I'm so happy to be back, and I am so happy to be here talking about this issue with you guys today. So, my friends, it's the Canadian protests just officially ended. In fact, it's been well over a month since they started. And when you have a month of continued protests happening, that is not just a month long of protests, but also a month long of potential for media abuse. And that is certainly what has been happening amongst the corporate media these days as it relates to the protests. My friends, the protests have been smeared. They have been besmirched. They have been attacked with so many different lies and so many different buzzwords by various figures in the media. I can just give you some examples here. CNN, when they covered this, they covered it several times, but on Inside Politics, when they covered this, they quoted the Ottawa police chief's words, and the Ottawa police chief called the protest an act of sedition. They also uncritically quoted a bunch of other buzzwords, such as the protest being a threat to democracy, so to speak. The Washington Post, one of their cartoonists, drew several defamatory pictures, which I'll show here on the screen, depicting the truckers as fascist and all other manner of ugly political words. Joe Scarborough, the ever so brilliant MSNBC host, called the protests a cult. And MSNBC also unfairly covered the protests as if they are some sort of some sort of bad action happening in the Canadian space right now.
And the enemy, their enemy, themselves, because they've become what they hated. They've become what they mocked. And now they're taking food from soup kitchens because they're so put upon for being asked to do what they've been asked to do, required to do their entire lives. It's a cult.
Yes, it is. A historic moment in the...
Trevor Noah used an example of a single individual. Well, I'll show that on the screen here too. A single individual who has a very distorted sense of history to supposedly represent the entirety of the Canadian protest movement.
Well, basically, if you want to compare Canada to anything, it's like Hitler's Germany, and we're like the Jews, eh?
You see, this is why we shouldn't be banning books. Because now this guy thinks that the Holocaust is when you can't take a shit in a Tim Hortons. I mean, even Marjorie Taylor Greene is looking at this guy like, dude, this isn't anything like the Holocaust. There's no soup here at all.
Oh, man, I don't understand how he even got his... Anyway, I'll leave my rant about Trevor Noah for later. My friends, all of these people who I just showed you, they are using the reputation of their institution as a means to convey information that is distorted and not even true. First of all, to call the protest, or the former protest rather, an insurrection is to commit a definitional fallacy. They were not per se an insurrection, as they would have you understand. An insurrection is when someone goes and tries to overthrow or topple a government. Now, the etymology of the word insurrection, or at least that's how the word insurrection has been used to refer to other similar instances that happened recently. Now, the etymology of the word insurrection actually goes back to simply a simple action of rising up. So I suppose, in a sense, they were insurrectionists because they did rise up. But is it a bad thing to rise up against civil authority? Well, if the civil authority is using immoral means to conduct their business, as Justin Trudeau has been wont to do, then I would say that we all have a moral obligation to rise up against civil authority. Scarborough calling it a cult. So again, what do these words mean? Well, there was a brilliant writer that said that the word cult is simply, and I forgot his name, but I'll show his name later on the screen, is simply a word one uses to describe people they don't like. He said this back in the 90s. Now, obviously, the word cult means something different than that. But for the purposes of this video, that is how we're going to treat the word cult. Because the word cult actually doesn't mean anything sinister if you look at its etymology once again. If people actually consider the philosophy of language, they would realize how a lot of these words are being used not for their meanings, but for their associated meanings. So for example, if I say kill the lights, right? Obviously that's going to evoke a more visceral reaction into someone than if I simply say turn off the lights. But again, kill the lights is more visceral because it has the word kill in it. But kill the lights doesn't mean anything more different than turn off the lights. Yet, these people, the people in the media, the word wizards, as I like to call them, are using language and how we associate language with concepts and meanings as tools to make you scared. So there's a reason why, according to Gallup, about only 36% of American adults have any inkling of trust whatsoever in the media. Now, that is an amalgamation of two number sets that I have made. Gallup says that 7% of United States adults say they have a great deal of trust in newspapers, radio, and television reporting. And 29% says a fair amount. Everyone else is in the negative. That is absolutely catastrophic for the folks who are in the media, and that's absolutely catastrophic to anyone who is in the old media industry. This is why independent reporters and independent media, like Christian Watson, like Tim Pool, are rising up because there is a catastrophic mistrust in how the corporate media, the old media that has used its reputation to give you misinformation in many cases, is treating things. But the fact that there is still 36% of adults who trust the media, the old world media, in any capacity is still high. If you had been listening to the old world media, you would think that the Canadian truckers were a bunch of people that wanted to destroy the government, that wanted to completely destroy the society they were in. If you listen to Trudeau, you would believe that they are neo-Nazis and Confederates, because that's what he said on the floor of the parliament, that they are all waving Confederate flags and and swastikas, and that's what they are, right? Once again, what he did there is what they're doing with words. What Trudeau did there is he's associating the entirety of the group with a few concepts that were near the group, but not a part of the group. If you have a decentralized movement, which is precisely what the truckers were, they were a decentralized movement that is protesting for one thing, and there's no way to keep other people out of the group because it's decentralized, and a bunch of people who do not share the values of the group come in and wave flags that are also antithetical to the values of the group, do you consider them a part of the group? Of course not. You would consider them as antithetical to the values of the group. But the politicians and some of the people in the media are trusting that you're not going to think that deeply because thought, even an ounce of critical analysis, would kill the narrative you have seen on your screen thus far in this video. But I also want to share something else with you. First principles is quite important, my friends. The British tried painting the American colonists who rose up as evil folks as well, who simply wanted to destroy society. But the Americans, just like the Freedom Convoy, had a set of first principles, or at least some folks in the convoy did. So, the convoy was decentralized, but it had certain cluster groups that were a part of the worldwide protest movement, which has been a huge push against vaccine and mask mandates over the past 2 years that we have seen medical tyranny sick on the people. And one of the groups that was organized in the Freedom Convoy is a group called Canada Unity. And Canada Unity had what is called a Memoranda of Understanding. Now, we've had the Washington Post say that the Freedom Convoy protesters are indicative of white supremacist colonial settler mentalities, And in that article, the person literally argues that freedom is white supremacy and is indicative to white supremacy movements. We've had a lot of people associate these people with racist and Confederates. Yet, if one simply looked at the Memoranda of Understanding, we would see how antithetical the values of white supremacists and Confederates are to the Canadian protest movement. So, I'm reading from the Memorandum of Understanding, and this is what they wanted the Trudeauian government to sign as a means of settling their demands. This says, "Thank you for choosing to take part in this unprecedented nationwide movement. Canada Unity represents and defends a coalition of concerned Canadian citizens, permanent residents, Indigenous communities, employers, employees from private and government bodies, institutions, and business at large." Now, notice, Indigenous communities. So allegedly, the Freedom Convoy are settler colonialists, according to the Washington Post article, which you can all find the link in the comment section down below, the description down below, excuse me. And yet, a part of the Memorandum of Understanding, their righteous statement of first principles, their list of demands, their list of grievances that we're going to use a page from the American Revolution, is an inclusion of Indigenous people. But once again, if you had been listening to the people who are in power, who use their voices over the air to convince you about things in the old world media, who use the reputations of their positions, whether it's Trudeau or their institution, whether it's Washington Post or MSNBC, to lie to you, you wouldn't know any of this because they're not conveying this information to you. Even CNN making that very narrow reporting saying, well, the Ottawa police chief said this. I don't care what they said, because guess what? It's a narrow idea. If you're going to show what the Ottawa police chief said, you ought to also show what the protesters are saying, and they're not doing so, because this is not about conveying information. And there are a list of demands in this Memorandum of Understanding that don't at all seem to me to entail an insurrection or to entail anything dangerous. And they say this: by having the Senate of Canada and the Governor General of Canada sign this Memorandum of Understanding into action, they agree to immediately cease and desist all unconstitutional, discriminatory, and segregating actions and human rights violations. It calls for an immediate instruction to all levels of the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to not only stop, but furthermore waive all SARS-CoV-2, and not limited to SARS-CoV-2, fines that have been issued and imposed upon its citizens, institutions, and private enterprises. And it also urges them to immediately reinstate all employees in all branches of all levels of government, and not limited to promote this to the same to private industry and industrial sectors of employees with full lawful employment rights prior to the wrongful and unlawful dismissals. And it also instructs all levels of government and private sector that the illegal use of vaccine passport must cease and desist immediately. This is the insurrection. These are the radical promises. Reinstate people who have been immorally fired from the government, suggest the reinstatement of people that have been fired from private companies for the same reason, not make me show my private medical history on to people who are not my doctors, and get rid of things that force me to do things that are against my conscience. These are the radical, evil, insurrectionist values that a majority of the Canadian protesters, which include Indigenous folks, stood upon. This was not talked about amongst the old media because it doesn't benefit them talking about it. So my friends, this is not merely bias. I can get into the fact that the violence are a narrative as well. The protesters were violent, and then the organizers, I'll give you a few examples. Tamara Litch, one of the organizers, was arrested for an attempt for counseling to the commit of the offense of mischief. Christopher John Barber was arrested for a similar charge as well. There were over 191 people arrested from the entire protests. 103 were charged. A majority of those charges, or almost all those charges, were mischief and obstruction of justice. So, charges that amount to misdemeanors, which are not at all violent crimes, which simply mean you're inconveniencing people, are being called insurrection. Isn't that interesting? My friends, this egregious abuse of reality and words and language and of trust is not simply bias, as I mentioned before. This is rather a grappling with what I call the subjective. And this is where I'm going to get philosophical on some of you. My apologies that you're not used to that, but this is what's important if we're going to fight these things foundationally. when we stop looking at institutions, rather, because institutions are simply extensions of the wills of people. MSNBC is nothing better than a bunch of Joe Scarboroughs, if indeed a bunch of Joe Scarboroughs are in MSNBC. So the people matter more than the institution because the people direct the institution per se. So if that's the case, then the opinions of those people, the worldviews of those people, and how they use those worldviews and opinions to shape their analysis, i.e. the subjective, is what we have to focus on to understand what's going on here. So, my friends, the subjective is a feature of human experience. Every single one of us has our own set of values, beliefs, stakes, whatever. Even me, as you know. I'm a believer in natural law theory. I'm a believer in individualism. So even I have these things. So all of us, it's a universal experience. This is not just focused in the media. This is not just Trevor Noah. This is not just Joe Scarborough. And it's harder to obtain objectivity when we hold on to these beliefs. And it's easier to do so when we look out into the world. So a way to rectify the subjective is by looking at the world and seeing what the world says, and then viewing that for what it is, and then afterwards applying our values to it. So for example, if I go out and I see a man getting punched in the face by someone, and he apparently had no instigation on the man's part, my values, my belief in natural rights says, hey, that's an unjust use of force against that man. That's bad. Now, what if something had happened before I had walked out there that the man had done? Perhaps the man had shot that other person's mother, or was threatening to shoot someone, and had a gun in his hand, was going towards the person, and the man's use of force actually stopped the man from doing something violent. What if that happened? Well, then again, that will revalidate my calculus. So my problem is this: we have to have a set of facts in front of us before we use our values. But what happens a lot of times is that the values of these people in the old media come first, and the set of facts comes second, or doesn't come at all. That's the problem. And so how do we overcome this urge for the subjective? The better question is it possible for us to completely escape the trap of our own experience? Well, Frederick Nietzsche didn't seem not to think so. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche makes a critique of the Greek philosopher Socrates. Socrates liked to make value judgments about things, and Nietzsche absolutely abhorred when someone makes a value judgment about things. A value judgment is simply saying that a thing is good or bad. And so Nietzsche said that if you make a value judgment about life, you cannot do that. So if you say that life is good or bad, you cannot do that. Why? Because all human beings are living. And so all human beings are biased to believe, or have some stake in believing, that living has some value to it. Therefore, the value judgment is not good. Now, Nietzsche made value judgments about other things, but about living, he did not. So here comes the question then. Here comes the very, very important question. Is it possible for us to look outside of our individual interests and into the world to form conclusions? I say it is, but it only is going to happen through discipline. See, the problem is when you allow yourself to cave to your own experiences, you will never be able to grow. This is why experience must be a developing thing rather than a static thing. Some people justify their entire lives by saying, I was raised to do X. Well, were you always meant to stay in X, though? Because what you were raised to do may not be what you are meant to do in this point in time. Similar to the media. Now, the problem is when you have these institutions that are bound foundationally to a particular political ideology, whether it be MSNBC, CNN, or whatever, they cannot move beyond the trap of experience, i.e. the subjective, because their entire legitimacy, their ability to be on the air, their ability to exist is based squarely in the subjective. Therein lies the problem. We are living amongst people who give us information, amongst politicians like Trudeau, who give us information, who are trapped by their own experience. And if they were to even forsake their own experiences, even if they wanted to, it would threaten their way of life. It would threaten their hold on authority. It would threaten their ability to do what they do. Hence, the principle of self-interest. Oh, my friends, there's a way to fight this. Ultimately, we are all a minority of one. Not all of us. All of us do not have the ability to change the world. and nor should we try to change the world. But what we can do, we can change how we interact with the world. And my friends, if enough of us were to simply withdraw from the dictates of the politicians and withdraw from the allure of the established media, and we were to do our own research, look within, and look out in the world, as opposed to applying our values immediately to everything, then perhaps we would have a much better grasp on reality, a much better grasp on what is true and what is false, and a much better mind for which to deal with the challenges that we're necessarily going to face as people who think, or as human beings in general. That is the solution. But let me ask you a question. Are you willing to rise up, question your beliefs, look outside of yourself, evaluate everything, even things that you hold dear so to your heart, so you can usurp any falsehood that tries to take you? Or will you fall to the same trap that Scarborough, Trevor Noah, CNN, all of them have fallen in, and are trying to take the political discourse in the West down by not evaluating anything critically and simply applying your values to everything before even knowing what you're applying them to? The latter is a recipe for disaster. The former may very well be the elixir that saves the American experiment and allows the West to persist as it has been for so many years. Think on it, my friends. I love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much for being patient. This is the first of many. Apologies if there's some hiccups graphically or whatever, but we're going to get better. We're going to get better. I'm excited. I'm inspired. My friends, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, donate to my Patreon if you so please. That's your choice. Join my Discord for more pensive conversations. I love you guys so much, and please, you better stay pensive. Bye, guys.